One thing with street photography that everyone asks is about focus, and it is usually warranted because street photography is very difficult to capture anything in focus, especially when it's quick action kind of stuff. So, this week we're talking about zone focusing. Zone focusing really is an estimation, it's a calculation, if you will, that precedes a guess. And it's a technique that people in street photography like to use, and it really can be used anywhere. But this is a concept which is not super easy to implement, but it is kind of easy to understand if you know the basics of it. So, the first thing you have to understand with zone focusing is that it is a little bit different than what you're used to with critically focusing a lens. Now, critically focusing is what we always do. It is typically where we select a single subject and we focus to that subject. And if we change that subject and we move to a different direction or the subject changes, whatever, we adjust focus again. Zone focusing is a little bit different because essentially we're going to set a zone, a range, a distance with our lens and not change the lens every time the subject changes, generally speaking. And that is the difference. That's the basis of zone focusing. So, the big thing with aperture here is the fact that this is going to control your depth of field. That's your closest point and furthest point of an image, which is going to be in focus. It's a depth, it's a zone, it's a distance from point A to point B that is either completely, partially, or not in focus at all, depending on the aperture you set. So the easy example to understand this with is like at f2.8, you have a pretty thin margin or a pretty thin zone or field of which is in focus, as compared to something like f16 or f22, which gives you a much wider area. It gives you a much deeper area of focus compared to f2.8. So essentially, we're going to set it to f8 and do this along with me because it'll make a whole lot more sense. But if we set this to f8, you'll see why in a second, but essentially this will give us a decent area of focus when it comes to depth of field, and that's what's being controlled by aperture. So all of this leads off with selecting an aperture that makes sense. Again, remember, you have to keep ISO and shutter speed and your environment in concert and in the forefront of your mind, but essentially we're going to set aperture first and then it's going to dictate everything else behind it. So let's try that other part next. Once we've set our aperture at whatever we're going to pick, whether that's f8 or f16 or whatever, we then can set our zone. So if you look at the actual lens of the camera, you can see that there's a distance ring on the focus ring, and there's also a line of mirrored, what looks like mirrored apertures on the next part of the lens. And that's how we're going to set our zone, because essentially by choosing that aperture, we're then setting where those 2 points are, our front point and our back point of our lens. And realistically, as long as we can follow our typical iron triangle guideline and use f8, this is going to give us a good point or a good margin for depth of field. And you'll see that in the focus ring, there's actually a line where it shows you your distances. So for instance, it might be in feet, it might be in meters. It can be really either one. It just kind of depends on the manufacturer of the lens. But realistically, the point is this, that you can adjust your distance, your front point and your back point based on your aperture. And that will give you your zone. And everything in that zone will be to some degree in focus. Essentially, these higher f-stops will give you a wider range compared to like 5.6 or f4, for instance. And you'll see that in the range and the distance on the bottom of the lens. So when we focus, we can actually see that there are other numbers there, which are our focusing points, our distances. And this one is actually in feet. So if I set it to f8, I can have something like 4 feet, hopefully you can see that, to just under 25 feet on the far end. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Essentially, higher f-stops gives you a wider range, and wider focal lengths like this 28 mil is going to be better for this than like a 50 or a 70 mil because your ranges will be so small. So that's how you do it. that is the actual way to set the zone. So hopefully all that makes sense. If it doesn't, leave a comment down below, but generally that is the easiest way that I can explain it. Your aperture is going to dictate that zone, and your zone is going to be set by your focus ring, and you're going to see that in 2 points, one on the left side of the lens and one on the right. And your left point is going to have your close point, and your right side is going to have your furthest point of your zone. And that is the distance at which it's going to be in focus between point A and point B. When we talk about optics and cameras and lenses and anything like this, realistically, only one point of that lens is ever going to be in focus at any given time. And that's how focus works. That's why we critically focus. We pick a subject, we focus. We see another subject, we focus again. And that's really how it's supposed to go. When you deal with zone focusing, the reason why street photographers do this is because there are so many subjects that you're trying to capture. They're moving quickly, and inevitably, you're trying to get more opportunities. You're trying to get more at bats, if you will, if you catch the baseball reference. But realistically, the point is that it is a controlled misfocus, meaning that when we have it at f8 and we have our range from 5 feet to 25 feet, only one of those points, and that's usually somewhere in the middle, is going to be actually sharp and in focus. And everything outside of that is going to be arguably out of focus to some degree. So, in that same example, 5 feet to 25 feet, let's say that at 8 feet or 10 feet is perfectly in focus. Let's say 10 feet. So, whatever the subject is at 10 feet will be perfectly in focus. And then something that is at 12 feet will be a little less sharp. Something that will be at 14 feet, a little less sharp. Something that is at 8 feet, still a little less sharp, but it is arguably inside the zone. So things that are in the zone are still kind of out of focus, and you have to know that. Inevitably, the idea of acceptable focus means that it is arguably kind of in focus to some degree, if you will. I know there's a whole math equation that goes into this, but really that's the layman's terms that I can gather. And realistically, it's just something for you to understand is that this does not mean that every single thing will be perfectly tack sharp just because you got it between 5 and 25 feet. You just have to remember that there is an actual point of focus, and this technique is great when you're trying to get broad strokes of an image. But if you're trying to do this on a single subject and you're trying to do something like portraits and you're trying to snap them off really quickly, you're probably going to miss a ton because you aim small, miss small, right? But when you have a single detail, it makes it so much harder. So keep that in mind. So that's what I have on zone focusing. Hopefully, this helps you out. Hopefully, you will let me know how this whole thing turns out for you. If you've never tried this before, make sure to come back to the video and let me know what you tried out. If you ran into any of the issues that I mentioned, let me know down below. Maybe there's something I can help you with. And maybe if I can't, there's a lurker down in there in the comments section that is much better at it than I am and also can help out. I've noticed that a lot in the comments that even if I don't get to respond to you, somebody else will. So don't just walk away from it. Make sure you ask your question because maybe I can or maybe somebody else can get to you. Inevitably, while you're down there, don't forget to check out the usual social links for Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. They're down there as per usual. So hit me up down there as well. I would look forward to talking to you at all of those other locations, no matter what it is. Beyond all of that, I just want to say thank you guys as usual for checking this one out. And I also want to say thank you so much for sticking around during this period of time, which has not been super consistent. And hopefully, in the coming weeks, I will have a reason for you. I will kind of give you a little bit of insider information here shortly on what's up. It's all good stuff. Don't worry, channel's still cool. I just hope to explain to you and be able to give you some of the cool stuff that is coming down the pipe. Beyond all that, I just want to say thank you again, and I will see you guys, as always, in the next one.